welcome to another one of our People First talks. I see some familiar faces and some new ones. So for anyone who's new to this community, the People First community is bringing together individuals and organizations. It's now growing. We have more than 1,200 from across sectors from around the world who believe in this idea that if we want to achieve sustainable development, it's not going to come through technical interventions alone. It has to be through investment in people and through growing the leadership of people, and particularly those who are local and most proximate to the challenges we're working to address. And so over the last couple of years, we've been having these People First talks, which are just conversations with different people in our community to really understand, well, what is the leadership we need? How do we develop people? And how do we do that? And so today I'm really excited to have with us two amazing guests, John Kania and Laura Calderón de la Barca. They are from the Collective Change Lab, and I'll just say a word or two about them, but then I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. Their work is actually at looking at how systems change. And so we're going to get a chance to look into that and what's the leadership we need. And one of the pivotal pieces of work they've been doing is looking also at the role of healing. How do we think about trauma and healing in systems change? And what does that mean for the people, and how do we grow our leadership, and how do we grow healing-centered systems? So it's going to be a very exciting conversation. John, you may have seen, has published a number of seminal pieces on systems thinking over the years, The Dawn of Systems Leadership, Healing for Systems Change. Laura has also published. She is an expert in collective and intergenerational trauma and healing, a psychotherapist, researcher, and educator working with communities across Latin America and Africa. And so without further ado, I'm going to allow you both to introduce yourselves. We'll be in conversation. And like always, if you have questions, please put them into the chat. We'll speak for about 20, 25 minutes and then just open it up to questions as we go along. John and Laura, maybe first introduce yourselves and what brought you into this work around thinking about leadership within systems and around thinking about healing. Tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Well, I'll start. So what brought me to this field, I think a lot of people end up in this field because of similar things as me. I needed healing for myself first, you know. I have a complex identity. I am Mexican and both indigenous and Spanish and other, I belong also to other lineages, but these are the two main components. And so the fragmentation, because of what has happened between these two parts, was something that I have had to deal with. And I've also experienced racial bullying at school. And so that also left a deep imprint in me. And so I felt I need to heal, but you know what? Wait a minute. So does Mexico, because we have not finished accepting our indigenous roots with honor and respect. And that's something that's missing. So the journey for me started with my own healing. And then for my PhD, I decided to create a therapeutic session for my country. So I headed down to Australia and I learned with a man that's a specialist in chaos and complexity theories. And so that was the beginning of a long journey around healing. I also trained with a man called Thomas Hubel, who is doing a lot of work on collective trauma healing. I was there for about 7 years. And that's also where I ended up meeting John. And got invited to write the healing systems piece that we published with the Stanford Social Innovation Review last year, which became the most read article, which I think speaks to the hunger there is for this topic, to have language, to have, other ideas. How do we address the presence of trauma in systems? And with that, over to you, John.
Thanks, Laura. Well, yeah, it's nice to be with everybody, and thank you all for inviting us into your space. I've been working in the social sector at this point for about 25 years. Prior to that, had a career in business. But what really motivates me and what brings me to the work is really to sort of try like sort of a career-long interest in this question of how social change happens and really trying to better understand that myself and see if I can help others understand that. And I think probably the most influential factor for me in that process has been my own spiritual journey. And in that context, really trying to better understand the conditions that support individual and group transformation. And, so what does that mean? It's practices like circles and meditation and ritual and ways of embodiment and other approaches that are really about enhancing our listening from the heart. And as I think about the world that we're in modern Western culture, which pretty much dominates much of the world, these sorts of transformational practices are not, for the most part, embedded in the work we do when we do social change work. And so what brings me to the work is how can we actually sort of think in a very different way that is very much from the inside out as we think about systems change and transformational change. That's why I'm in the work.
Yeah, wonderful. So much there already in terms of if we want to change systems out there, it starts with us. Laura, your own journey, and John, both of yours is exemplifying that. And also, how do we, in this modern world, think about bringing back some of these indigenous ways of knowing and leading? And so really excited to get into this conversation with you both. Well, let's dive into for people who might be newer to this area of healing, like why focus on healing-centered system change? Like, tell us a little bit more about that, what you discovered about why that's important, and then we'll get to what does that mean for developing us as leaders, who do we need to be leading this work? But yeah, maybe a little bit of the why. What have you discovered? Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to
Well, I'm
go?
happy to start. And I think it's
Yeah.
part of why I love working with Laura is that we kind of have come from different spaces and sort of arriving at a similar answer. And Laura's very much come from the healing space and the collective healing space, and I very much come out of the systems change world. And so when I try to answer the question of why healing-centered systems change, I start with, okay, what's going on in the systems change world? And um, some of you may have heard my observation that 90% of what I see happening in the systems change world today, in the Western modern world, is structural. So it's focused on policies, it's focused on scaling practices, and it's focused on access to resources. And that's important. But where transformation lies is in the relational. And what do I mean by the relational? I mean the power dynamics, the relationships and connections, and who is woven into who, and the mental models, the embodied models that are part of this. So if your quest is transformation, which I'm guessing for many of you on the phone, or on the phone, on the computer, wherever we are. It used to be the phone, maybe 25, 30 years ago. But, if your quest is transformation, then, there's a need to focus much more of our effort on the relational. And of course, that's part of, as I'm understanding, the space that you all have tried to build here is how do we focus more on people, recognizing that is where transformation lies? How do we focus on the relational? So if you say, there needs to be more focus on the relational, why isn't that happening today? Well, my perspective or observation on that is it's not happening today because of fragmentation and disconnection. And that's happening at an individual level and a collective level. Fragmentation and disconnection is why we're not engaged in the relational. And then you unpack that further and you say, what is the cause of fragmentation and disconnection? And I would say the leading cause is trauma. And trauma that's not integrated back into the individual or into the system. So we have so many of our systems today that I would describe as feeling stuck. When you talk to people within the system, it's like stuck. There's resistance, there's blockages, there's defensiveness, there's denial. And I would suggest that sort of, again, a leading cause of that is trauma that's in the system that's left unresolved and unintegrated, both at the individual and the collective level. I want to emphasize also the converse of that, because this is the opportunity to putting healing at the center of our systems change efforts. If you actually, to the degree that trauma in the system is resolved and integrated, healing can produce a tremendous amount of energy and creativity and open up new and untapped potential. And that to me is the real exciting part of this. Okay, because trauma can feel a bit scary, and why do we wade into that? Well, think about, many of us I've gone through significant trauma as a child. And until I actually dealt with that trauma, it was hard for me to see the world in an optimistic and just in a way that opened up answers for me. And so it's true for individuals, it's true for society. I fundamentally believe that if more healing takes place, we will see answers collectively that we don't see today. And that's the reason for healing-centered systems change, in my opinion.
Mm.
Wonderful. And Laura, I'll also get you to share your thoughts. And there was a comment in the chat, just so when we're speaking about language, like even if you can, when you say trauma, what do you mean? When you say healing, what do you mean? But also just in your own words, why is this important to you?
Thank you so much, Radha. Well, I think that John did a beautiful job of explaining that. And I feel how much we have woven together our understanding since we first started. It's been quite a journey. And for me, part of what was really amazing, from healing was starting to understand that it was not just about us individually, but about us collectively. When we look at it from the healing side, the first version of a system was family systems, right? And seeing that there's a dynamic that hurts the family, that the system itself is both a side for trauma and a side for healing. And with that, let me just go to the question that's in the chat. My understanding of healing, and the reason why we're using healing versus curing, is because healing has, like, when I'm a linguist originally, and I love language and what it helps us see. And the word healing is coming from the Middle English that has in its roots the same root as wholeness and as holy, sacred. And so healing is the process through which, accessing that which is sacred in you, that is already a part of who you are, that can help reestablish your sense of wholeness. That part of you is always whole, no matter how many layers of trauma you have on top of it. And that's the part that we need to access for us to heal. Curing has to do with bringing in resources from outside to support that process. But without that capacity that for healing that we have, healing wouldn't happen. So that's why we're using healing, and that's how I'm seeing that. And in terms of trauma, the word trauma comes from the Greek, and it means wound. And so, trauma is a wound that has two moments. One is the moment where whatever happened to you happened, but then the second moment is what happens then in your nervous system, in your autonomic nervous system, that remains in you unhealed, and that part needs to have its own distinct aspect for healing that will be connected to this moment. But once this moment is gone, trauma remains, that wound remains. So maybe there was, you had a broken bone, but the way that it happened was particularly traumatic. And then once your bone heals, you still feel something that remains in time, even after the healing of the original wound happened. That's the trauma side. And that has many layers. There's the individual, but there's also the intergenerational, when our parents have experienced trauma and they did not get to heal that before they had children, then that gets passed on. Now we know, through the epigenetic studies that have been done, that there are a variety of mechanisms actually within ourselves that absorb that information and transmit it to the next generations. And I'd also just want to say that the resilience that we acquire is also transmitted to the next generations, because it sounds like, oh my God, all this trauma from all the generations, and we're going to have to carry that and heal that. No, all the resilience comes along with it too. So we have that. And then there's larger levels of that. So collective trauma, like, COVID-19, I think, is one of the most clear examples that actually happened. I would say that's one of the first global collective traumas, because, the whole world had to experience that. And then there's also what happens in systems, when we bring all of these different layers of trauma into the system, and the system itself as an entity also carries trauma. So I'll leave it there, Rada, to see
Yeah, no, I think
where
that's
else
such
we
a
want to go
good,
from there.
clear explanation. This idea that
Mm.
we're stuck in these patterns, and oftentimes they're very young patterns or inherited patterns that we've taken from generations. And if we can do the healing work to unstuck, to integrate this, then we're not operating from that same stuck pattern. I really liked what you'd said, John, that something new can open up. We can have a greater source of collective creativity. And it seems like there's work to be done both at the individual level, which might be your young patterns, understanding how these beliefs are showing up in you. But as we're seeing in the world today, what I'm also hearing is there's real collective work to collectively process some of this trauma that's been sitting in our systems, whether it's injustice or a loss of certain people's culture or conflict or war. So let's actually let's actually get into some of these examples, because some of the work in this people first communities, well, how do we activate the leadership of local leaders in communities who, when I think about some of these practices, many of them do come from indigenous wisdom. We used to have healing circles. We actually used to be in relation with one another, and we've lost some of this. Laura, I know you're doing some incredible work around the world. I wonder if you can bring this to life in some examples of how this is showing up in real systems and communities. Maybe you can share a couple and we can dig into those.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So part of what is, my own work, but also is, really uplifting the work. There's so much work being done already in the world. And I really want to name that because to some people, it might feel like this is kind of woo-woo or pie in the sky. No, it's not. There's a lot of work actually happening. So I'd first like to bring in one of the examples of what's happening in Colombia. And Colombia has had the need to look for collective healing because of this armed conflict that has been ongoing. And then there was this peace process through which people who had been part of the guerrillas were invited to lay down their arms and, come back into civil society. And many of them did. And they were offered two choices. One was to move to a different region and to start over, where people did not know, about their past. But they were also offered, the option of staying in the place where they had been. And some of them actually stayed. So, the work that I want to tell you about is from a group of people who actually stayed in the village of Biota in Colombia. And but you can imagine the challenge of that, as if you kidnapped or murdered people, and then their families are there, and now you're part of their community. The level of tension and trying to create a new future from there is just really hard. And so the work of Duna Foundation, which is what I want to tell you guys about, is bringing in work that has 3 layers. The first one is teaching people how to work with their own individual trauma at the level of the body. So they do they use mind-body techniques to help people learn how to regulate their nervous system. And then once they have that, then they help people deal with the interpersonal dimension of the pain that has been caused. And then there's a third layer, which is making repairs to the earth herself, because the earth is also a victim of all of this. And so what that actually looks like is in Biota, the story that I'm going to tell you starts where first, the groups of people that are going to be participating in this healing process get together in a room, and the tension is really strong. You can see there's different groups of people, the peasants who have been the victims on one side, the people from the army talking to the police, but just the two of them with their uniforms and holding onto their arms, like in their hands. And the people who were the ex-combatants on a different side, and the people from the government on a different side. So you can really literally see the fragmentation in the room, in the huddling of the different groups. And then the facilitator comes in, greets everybody, invites them to sit down in a circle, and then lays down a circular cloth, starts a candle going, and puts down her own a little sacred object that she brings. And she starts to invite everybody to bring their own sacred object and place it on the cloth as a symbol for their commitment to create a different space so that they can all talk about these things in a way that really creates a different future for all of them. And so they do that, and then they sit down, and then she starts to invite them to share about their favorite food so that they can start to find commonalities between them and start to kind of reconnect to their own humanity. And then as they talk about the food, then that leads to the territory, and that leads to what has happened in the territory. And then you can start to feel the tension arise again. So then they pause that, and they start to direct people to work with their bodies to, acknowledge the stress in the room and teach them how to do that. And as they start to become capable of doing that, then, they do 6 months of healing work. So after that comes the part that I mentioned about where they can now start to talk about things because they can hold the tension together. And then they start to do some work to create productive projects. And now that they can, get along better, to try to make some repair to the earth. So, for example, they do a nursery for planting local plants for from that region. And the men who were in the guerrilla, they have the paths in the jungle that they had been using, and they turned that into an eco-touristic project. And so by the end of the 6 months that this work takes directly on the ground, that you see a very different scene. The same group is now outside, and the arms are no longer in the arms of the people from the army and the police. They're leaning against a tree, and what's in the arms of the man from the army is a newborn baby from one of the ex-combatants, whose mother is now cooking for the whole group. And the whole group is planting, those native plants that they created in their nursery. They're planting them alongside a road that is one of the reparative works that the ex-combatants are offering the community. This road leads to the cemetery where their victims are interred. And they're also carving onto a wooden cross the names of the people that they killed. And this is what they're offering the community as a reparative work. So this is one example of what can happen when you bring, healing into the room. And so there's, the focus on creating new futures for the community. And also when you look at the system and how it changed, you can see, for example, that the police used to harass these men because they didn't know if they were getting rearmed when they were going into the paths that they had in the jungle. So instead of harassing them, now they're helping them out, with the drones, letting them know, hey, there, on this path, there was like a landslide, so you need to go repair that. So the community really starts to come back together. So the fragmentation that had been caused by the armed conflict starts to really get repaired, and people can start to see each other, as human beings again. So that's one example. So go ahead, Rada.
That's incredible. Let me ask one follow-up question there, and then John, I'll be curious if there's other examples that you can bring to life. I mean, so much of what we've been talking in this community is we need that collective leadership. We need people from different parts of the system coming together. And I can think about so many different challenges in our society where we could bring that model. And yet it seems daunting. Like this seems like incredible progress in 6 months that people who are on completely different sides are now able to talk to one another. Is it always, can we always make progress that quickly? Like can you talk through some of the tensions and like, what did that really take? What were some of the things that come up along the way? Like, just, as we start thinking about this as a new model, were there conditions that needed to be there in order to enable this to happen? Like, just help us understand kind of the grittier parts of it. And then John, I'll be curious to see if you have some other examples to share.
Sure. So, yeah, there had to be things in place. There's an order to how this happens. First, you really need to have the capacity to help people not allow their nervous system to simply take over, because that's where we have the trauma reactions. And until we are able to have that in place for the group, you cannot move into the next phase, because what you're going to open is going to be so much more intense that you really require that you have grown that capacity. And some of the things that were challenging in that example were also being able to find the language to support people in ways that they could really receive. And that's also why Duna Foundation uses a lot of scientific knowledge to help people understand their nervous system and how it works, so that they can relate to, this is something that is common to us all human beings, you know. And as we understand that better, we also come to see that when we have reactions, we're not trying to be difficult with each other, because this comes from our autonomic nervous system, and that's a part of our nervous system that is not controlled by our will simply. You know, there's these two parts. There's a voluntary nervous system. So if I want to raise my hand, that's, you know, that's the part of the nervous system that operates. But in the autonomic nervous system, that one is that it's tasked with all the functions that help us survive. So you don't have to be thinking about your stomach digesting for it to digest, or your kidneys filtering for them to filter, you know, the blood and creating urine. And that's where trauma lies. So trauma reactions are automatic reactions. So in order for us to heal from them, we need to connect and honor the wisdom in them. And the wisdom is that they're trying to help us survive. So when we can connect those two, then we can create a different outcome. And so people learn about this, and they learn the techniques to be with, you know, to accept whatever's happening in their body, and then to bring in a resource that they didn't have at the time, so that they can actually, you know, do that kind of healing. You know, this also takes preparation on the part of the organization. They need to, you know, they do between 1 year and 6 months of preparation. They have somebody local in the community that can help orient them. They do a lot of consultation before, to make sure that they have the right people. They, you know, need the leaders of the communities to be participating also. And, you know, in terms of the leaders, I feel that one of the most important things is for leaders to get to know their own trauma and to be able to relate to that, because if they don't, then they become kind of the glass ceiling for the organization to be able to heal. And John, I'll hand it over to you to speak more about that.
Yeah, no, lovely, Laura. I think everything you said is so resonant. I mean, just I guess a couple of comments. If we think about the example Laura gave, and I'll give another one or two, but it's a different worldview that the people who are engaged are taking. I would say that much of, again, I'll speak Western modern world, but the worldview towards social change is a fix-it orientation. We were trying to fix problems. You hear that all the time in philanthropy, right? It's about fixing social problems. This is a healing orientation, okay? And so to the degree that the question, one of the questions is like, well, you know, how do you judge success, right? How do you judge progress? Well, progress in a fix-it environment is, you know, higher high school graduation rates, et cetera. And whatever the heck it takes to do that, we'll do it. Progress in a healing orientation is that people are working together different. They're able to regulate themselves. The system is starting to regulate, re-regulate itself. And so it's just a different worldview. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, because you can walk into a community and say, hey, let's do healing-centered systems change. And many of the people in the community are not operating with that worldview. So that's why in our work, we're trying to put out articles and other sort of making the case for this. But I think we have to recognize that in the modern Western world, most of the orientation is fix it. And this doesn't quite fit with that. And I think the important aspect of that to sort of acknowledge is the starting point is different. You know, I've been a strategy consultant both in the business world and in the last 25 years in the social sector. And well, where do you start? You start with a strategic plan, and you collect data and you bring together people to talk about it. This is a different starting point that says you actually have to do a lot of work in a different way towards a different intended outcome, at least in the short to medium term. And you know, the leaders need to be open to that. And so I think that's one of the things that, is finding places where leaders are. And as Laura said, this work is going on around the world in a lot of different ways. So part of it is just bringing some visibility to it. But, I'll just give you one other quick example just to sort of, you mentioned earlier, Rada, that, so much of this is very resonant and consistent with indigenous wisdom, and we need to recognize that. And one of the sort of most interesting cross-sector initiatives that I've seen is in Hawaii, where you've got a native population that is, like in many societies, overrepresented in the criminal justice system for youth. And their orientation finally came when the people that were all trying to support these youth said, we've got to reconnect in a different way and support them in reconnecting with their ancestors and connecting with the land, and connecting with their community and connecting with themselves. And that became the orientation towards their work. And they've had very positive and exciting results out of that in terms of supporting Native Hawaiian youth. Back to the point I made earlier, what is causing this? It's fragmentation and disconnection. So where can we help to sort of, heal that? And once we start to heal that, other things can become a lot easier.
Right. And if I could, looking at the question that Alexandra is offering us, what would be different about a healing systems intervention versus a community intervention? And John, I'm sure you can speak more to that than I can. But for my understanding is that the system is made up of the different sections of whatever it is that you're like. For example, if you have, the educational sector and the health sector coming together, it's not just the community of one. It's like different functions that are being served within a system by the different elements that make it up coming together. Whereas in a community, you might have, the community members coming together to create something. But here, there's this different functions that the different parts of the system serve that are coming together. And the healing aspect is that it's becoming whole again. Like there's this different parts that are starting to interact with each other in ways that they were not interacting. John, would you like to add?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I would also just say, so much in common, particularly if there is a recognition of the somatic nature of this work and the importance of understanding regulation and the autonomic nervous system, not only amongst people in the community, but particularly with the leaders. And as you just said, Laura, that, if the leader can't sit on the outside and say, oh, community heal thyself, they've got to go through the work themselves. And the minute they do, they will see the ways in which this, is a very different way of doing things and can open up spaces. So I think there's going to be a lot in common. I think again, the worldview of what we're trying to accomplish here, might, vary by, 60 degrees or what have you.
Let me ask two more questions, and then for anyone who's got something, a question, and I'm starting to see them, we're just going to put those in, but just two quick questions. One is, you've spoken about this as it's shifting worldviews. And so there's things we can do in communities, but there's so much we can even bring into our organizations and our workplaces. Like, how do we move from a fix-it to a healing worldview, like more interventionist to creating the conditions, more about like, I got to get a task done or an outcome to, well, how do we grow the leadership capacity? But switching worldviews actually is very difficult because you've grown up with a certain way. It's how you've got achievement. It's what you've been rewarded for. It's what the system rewards. So it seems like this takes a lot of unlearning as well, right? I've heard people say, but this is slower. We're not getting stuff done. We don't have time and space for this. Like, but you can't measure it, so it's not real. Anything you've learned as you've seen people do this work of unlearning that enables that, or is it just working with people who have the readiness? Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think the way it goes fast is if people who are in leadership positions are able to do this work. And the big challenge, of course, is we can't force anybody to do this work. It's you can invite people into the work, but you can't force them to do it. But if I think about myself and I think about my ability to, once I was able to see within myself how I'm getting triggered by the trauma that I've had in my life, I can so much easier see that when that's happening with others. And it just shifts the dynamic of how you do the work. If somebody is really super angry at you and you take it personally, which I can do, if I can start to understand that that anger is coming from potentially from the place where of trauma for that individual, I feel differently. Just the other quick example I'll give is when I get triggered, based off of the trauma that happened to me when I was 4 years old, um, you know, I shouldn't be the one leading, the effort at that point until I get myself, so I always say, when I get triggered, that's, it's 4-year-old John driving the bus, and you don't want 4-year-old John driving the bus. So what I need to do is work on myself so that when that happens, it happens in as short as time period as possible. But I do think the biggest challenge is how do we invite, various leaders into this, and as is often the case, it's by example. And it's by people that see their peers doing this work and can relate in a way and say, okay, but there are many challenges to the work, but I think the leadership one is critical.
Yeah, no, and I love this idea of, I think I love the bigger examples of doing this with communities and healing circles, but I also like the practical examples you've brought around just in any of our workplaces, understanding when trauma is leading for ourselves. What does that mean for kind of stepping back? And it also depersonalizes it, as you're saying. Like we can actually
Yeah.
see someone else, and instead of like, I don't understand where they're coming from, maybe their trauma is leading. Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Let me
Mm.
start bringing in some of the questions. Laura, is there anything you want to say on this? And then I'm going to
Yes,
bring in the next
yeah,
question from the
yes,
chat.
if I may. I mean, what John was saying is so essential, the example, but I would like to say why that works so well, I feel. And that is because our nervous systems are geared to connect to each other. So if you see somebody who can be in a situation where there's tension or stress, and they're able to stay regulated, that helps you co-regulate, but that also inspires you to say, oh, I want to be that person that is the one who can be, there can be stress and they can own that and they can be in that and they can become an agent for regulation. And the other thing that I just want to mention is, in accordance with that, just the fact that I'm sitting here next to my boss on the screen, and he can share about his trauma with me here, knowing that I respect him so much more for the fact that he can actually own that and say that. And that, that flies in the face of, the ideas that we have about how people should relate in a work situation. And I know I've shared with John about my own traumas, and, it's not like we're doing therapy with each other all the time, because that's not what's going on. But it's that we have found a way in which we can include the presence of our traumas, and we can be a support for each other as we move forward. And we have not lost respect for each other, because you know what? It's hard to do these things, and it takes courage to do these things. And so I have respect for John's courage to share this and to be able to share this with others, And so fostering this respect and fostering this, the trust that gets built between ourselves as we do this, I think is really important. And I just felt like we have an example right now. Let's take it and make it evidence so that, we can walk our talk, and you guys can feel what it feels like to have, the capacity to share about these things with your boss next to you.
I love that. What a beautiful example. We've also been experiencing some of that. And I think there's a power in the collective when this becomes something where actually you can have conversations and say, I'm noticing my trauma is coming up, or yours is, and you feel safe to do that. Yeah, so much more is possible. So I like thinking about this, not just growing individual capacities, but how do you start building this in whole teams and organizations? Let me actually get Sanaya, maybe if you can come off mute and share your question, because I think learning from where this is working is helpful. So Sanaya, if you're there and you can just come off and share your question. And then after that, anyone else has a question, raise your hand or put it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you both so much. This has been amazing already. I'm wondering about, so I've obviously, as everyone has experienced trauma and also experienced spaces that allow us to work through that trauma and heal from it. And in our work with children, I'm wondering if you have examples that you can share of how this approach to healing works within the existing education systems, if you've ever experienced that, or does it, in your experience, have to be a separate outside space? So basically, I'm wondering like how we can do it at a larger scale almost, or within existing systems, or do we always have to recreate them?
I can go, John, first.
Sure, go ahead.
And so what comes to mind is the work of Glasswing Foundation that has been working in Central America in several countries. And, you know, they bring together, they do work where they, you know, support people in learning how to regulate their nervous system also. And they work with the different constituents in the educational system. So with the children, with the teachers, with the parents, with the people in administrative roles. So yes, it is possible, and I'm happy to get you the information about them and get you in touch if you're interested. John, and I don't know if there's other.
Well, I think, thank you for the question, because I think you raised this, a question that we often get, and even something that we, you know, are working with ourselves is, you know, is this a process that sort of happens outside the organization and the network, or is it part of, you know, and is part of the work, or is it separate from the work? Is it its own little thing? And I think the answer is, you know, context is going to sort of help define that. But I don't think it can be totally separate. I think it really needs to be done in the context of the work, which does make it riskier. And Laura, I don't know, you and I talked about these, and you made this point, and hopefully I'm going to steal it. I hope it's okay.
Totally.
But you know, when you get into this work within the context of either think about an organization or think about, you know, a collective impact effort or a cross-sector effort, it does require, as Laura said, when she was using the example of me and Laura and how we work together, it does push the boundaries of sort of what, at least, you know, and I'll talk about the United States, you know, how people think about what you can say and sort of the environment, the workplace environment. And it does require an openness to thinking about different ways of, you know, addressing that. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge that, but I think this needs to be done in the context of the work. I think, you know, Peter Senge is doing some work with international baccalaureate schools and others, you know, around, you know, what he and his colleagues call compassionate systems. And so I think in different places around the world, this is already happening in an integrated way. And I would suggest that we need to think about it in an integrated way.
Yeah. And we can send some resources out of others who are doing it. And I think we're kind of on a journey around some of this stuff. Franco, I'm going to invite you to come off and share your question. And anyone else who has a question, just raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll call on you.
Thank you, Ra, and
And then
thank you, John and
Sanjan.
Laura, and thank you all for sharing so generously. My question is about national efforts of healing and how does your work relate to those? I come from Peru. We had a decade and a half of inner conflict that was quite gruesome in the 80s and 90s, left us with hundreds of thousands of people murdered. That was one of the big traumas that my parents and grandparents experienced firsthand, not me, but them. And there was a national effort of healing, one could say. It's called Truth and Reconciliation, just as the one similar in other countries, no? And so oftentimes when we are thinking about system change, one of the stop points is to see the policy efforts. You know, if I want to do system change in education, I look at the policy efforts and I see if there are opportunities, and I make up an opinion about myself about what's going on, whether it helps to what degree or not. And so it's the first time in this call that I've thought about the healing efforts, or let's say the healing policies, to borrow that term, in my country. And I don't know what to make of it. And I wanted to ask you around that. And considering that's the only ever effort. There's a national effort about this incredibly impactful decade. And there hasn't been any sectoral effort of healing. And so I just wanted to put it out. I don't know exactly how to phrase the question, but what do you think about these national efforts?
Well, first of all, I'm excited to find out about Peru. I was not aware that you had that in Peru as well. But as you tell me about, the policy efforts, what comes to mind is a framework that John actually created. So if I could borrow from you, John, and I love that we've learned from each other this way too. There is a framework called the Water of Systems Change. And, we often call it the inverted triangle because that's the shape in which it's presented, where on the top layer, you see that which is most evident within a system that shapes a system. And that's the policies, the practices, and the resource flows. And that is, when you create some change there, that's not the most impactful place for generating change. That is part of a system, and you have to do that too, for sure, but it's not necessarily what's going to create the most important transformation. There's two other layers, one which is not quite so evident, but that's more evident to people, which are the relationships within the system and the power dynamics. But the most impactful part where systems get transformed is when you change what John was saying. Initially, they called it the mental model, but we're calling it now the embodied understanding, because you have to really, something at the experience level needs to shift for you to actually transform at that level, and then start to generate other ways of relating, ways of having power dynamics, and changes in policy and practice that have a really deep rootedness in you and in reality. So what I hear is, when it's only the policies that are being changed without the rest of the process for people to actually have spaces where they can engage and transform their worldview, because they have had different experiences, because they have heard from others deeply, and they can see things they could not see before, that transform their way of being and their way of being in the world, then the policies usually are kind of like a Band-Aid on a broken bone. So John, I don't know if you'd like to add something more.
Yeah, we've got a couple other questions, so
Yeah,
I don't know
so
if you want.
so powerful to get to what's at the roots of things. But yeah, let's get to our other couple of questions. So Joyce, maybe we'll hear from you, and then Sanjanti, get our last question probably.
I just want to start by thanking you for this amazing work that you have been doing, and sharing this with us. I am working with we call it Collective Rising Leadership Institute, and it is a coaching program that works with the people, with the leaders of organization in teams, to really try and get them to be brought together by what is it that they are trying to do together. And I so completely agree with you. It begins with the individual. If the person themselves do not celebrate who they are, and then figure out also the changes that they need to make. Because the way we are taught is about the hero leader, who knows everything, who is completely together, who can't really be making mistakes and be admitting this. And one of the requirements is that unless the leader is actually willing to be vulnerable and work with their team to go where they want to go, but we found out that people need also to celebrate where they are, but at the same time, if the change doesn't come from within, a wounded soldier, it's very hard for a wounded soldier to carry another wounded soldier before their wound is healed. And this is a different way of thinking, And then I just wanted you to talk about the time element, because this process of just personal assessment of who am I and what am I, whatever, take 3 months, and then bring the team together, a team of the leadership team, and then the organization. And so you can see there are different layers, and then the network. What is it that brings us together that we need to deal with the inside so that we can be an instrument for transformation, to the society. So I wanted to hear a little bit about that, because this is very intriguing, because it is kind of reversing the way people think. I am the leader, I am everything, I can do everything. And I just want to say what we have seen with 85 people who have participated so far completely blows my mind, because people haven't ever thought this way. And all of a sudden, now I am the subject. And then the connection. I like you talked about fragmentation and disconnection. That is the point that we need to regain that contact. So I can talk a lot, but I wanted you just to say something. I'm very intrigued by what you're doing. And I think this is what we need to be able to have leaders that can lead in crisis and chaos. And they cannot do it alone. It's a collective needs to come together to start the change process, to continue the change process.
Well,
Thank
Joyce,
you.
I can hear and feel, I can feel your energy. And I'm excited by the work that you've described, and I think it's very resonant and consistent with what we're talking about. I think part of your question was, can you talk about time? Maybe I missed that, but if you didn't, I think everybody wants to solve the problem more quickly, right? And I think part of what we need to recognize is that in and of itself is a trauma response. The urgency is a trauma response. Whether or not your leadership and feeling you have to do it quickly because everybody's depending on you in that hero model, or you're in the community, and of course, yes, you want it to get better. And that, but I think, recognizing that the urgency is part of the response to trauma is, I think, really important. I think, I'll just sort of, because I know we're coming to the end, I'll just put out, one of the things we always often get asked is, yeah, this is really cool, but how you scale it, you know? And I think this is required, this is work that scales, but it scales in a different way. It's not about sort of scaling a professional teacher development process or a new model. It is really, there's a term that's starting to be used more often that we actually really quite like, and it comes from a Nobel laureate physicist, Ilya Prigogine, and he said that in a system, if a system is far from equilibrium, which most of our systems are, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to elevate the entire system to a higher order. Small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to elevate the entire system to a higher order. And I think the way that we see, if we need to use the word scale happening, is that it happens, it can be a teacher, it can be a classroom, it can be a school, it can be a district, it can be a cross-sector effort. All of those can be islands of coherence. All of those can be islands of coherence, but it's happening if you can. The island of coherence is the people that are part of that are, themselves operating differently, and then they're operating differently with each other. They're weaving their work in a different way where they are co-regulated. And that's the opportunity, is how do we, and once those islands of coherence start happening, they're in tractor. Other people want part of that. And we see that this is how social movements actually grow, right? And social movements are our best examples of sort of big change, right? So think about this as something that you don't have to do it everywhere all the time. Starting at a place of where can we form an island of coherence, which could just be one teacher in a classroom making change herself. But it can also be a larger cross-sector effort.
Yeah, I love that idea, John, of islands of coherence, and then connecting the dots. It's like, what are the bright spots and how can we learn from them? Because this is deeper work. It takes some courage to do stuff. So can we learn? Can we actually look at some of these bright spots? Sanjanti, if you have a very quick question, let's see if we can get to it. I know you've been hanging there for a while.
But thank you so much for creating the space for this discussion, Radha and John and Laura. Thanks so much for sharing your experience. I work in the social and behavior change space. We do a lot of people-centered, community-led design work. And one of the projects that I was working on was we were in Bangladesh when about 1 million Rohingya refugees fled Myanmar. And initially the host community was very welcoming and sympathetic. But then, this tension due to limited resources. And so the stress sort of bubbled over. We worked a lot with young people, bringing host community, young people, as well as refugee population together to unpack their stories. And through story circles, they were able to communicate the trauma that they had gone through. And there was a lot of, I wouldn't call it necessarily the kind of work that you do, but it was at least an understanding, coming to common terms of even sort of defining and describing what they went through. And that led to some social cohesion and solidarity. But John, you answered, one of the questions I had was the question of scale. The other question is about when is it the right time to do this? Because I felt like we waited until things kind of bubbled over and there was a lot of tension. Is there a better, more appropriate, ideal time to go in to do this kind of work with communities where you can kind of prevent even the tension from building up? Thank you.
Laura, do you have thoughts? Or
yeah, if you want to go, John.
Yeah, and we'll do like a quick, maybe the 1 minute answer, and maybe we can, it seems like there's a lot of energy, so I also have energy to create maybe other follow-ups.
Or then I'll just jump in then. So the thing is, there are certain elements that need to be in place if you want this to work well. So, the model that I described with Duna, where you first grow the capacity that people have to be able to meet the tension in the body, is super important, because if you do not have that, then there's going to be a lot more disruption and it's going to take longer. So if you go layer by layer, then the conditions that you create will make the second layer of intervention easier. And if you want to, we can leave you our contact details so that we can continue the conversation and see what other resources we might be able to connect you with.
Yeah, and just the 30 seconds that I'll add, or maybe 15, is that, I think the mistake I see the biggest when people get excited about this is they try to go too big too quickly. When you think about islands of coherence, is where can you start small where the conditions are more favorable to try to do this, not doing it everywhere. So.
Right.
Well, it's always a sign of a great talk when we're bubbling with questions at the end. So thank you so much, John and Laura. You've given us so much to think about. What we'll do is we'll send out the recording and video and some resources after this talk. And it seems like there's some energy and actually wisdom in this group. And so potentially I might even create another space for anyone who wants to follow up and trade examples and stories amongst us so we can continue to build the learning. So we'll send out more in a follow-up note. But big thank you to you, John and Laura, and to the group for bringing your own collective wisdom into this conversation. Excited to keep it going.
Oh, thank you. It's been wonderful to be with you all.
Yeah, and then really, tip hat off to the wisdom in the room also.
Yes,
I love to feel that we're with, like-minded souls.
Kindred spirits.
Kindred
Yes.
spirits, yeah, that's it. So
Amazing.
thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Until next time, take care, everyone.